So, right, well, I suppose we'll start. You, obviously I'm Matt. Oh, Matt. When did you start collecting 78s and why? I mean, it's kind of an obscure thing to do.
Well, I started collecting 78s after I'd already bought vinyl for a while. So how that came about was I was about 8, I suppose. I remember having a cassette recorder, and I had use of my dad's turntable that just played vinyl records. And then at some time later, I got a turntable of my own. And in between that time, started collecting 78. So I was always interested in, from the earliest age I can remember, I liked 60s music. And then I asked myself the question, what came before this? And that's obviously got me into 78s. So I suppose from listening to beat groups like the Searchers, the Hollies, Freddie and the Dreamers, Beatles, Rolling Stones, that sort of thing, and the Shadows and a lot of other instrumental groups, got into 50s rock and roll and jazz stuff over time. And then that's kind of drifted me off into 78. And I knew what a 78 was before I ever had one. And I kind of, I think when I first started buying vinyl, I used to buy either from, I guess I was about 10 when I started buying records, with my pocket money. Or if people had given you money for like birthday or Christmas or something. And I would buy things mail order. So I used to buy only 10? 10 or 10 approaching 11, I suppose.
Right.
But they'd have to be cheap things because obviously you didn't have sort of your own income.
Just run me through how that worked. How did you get in contact with people to buy mail order in the first place?
I think I probably got Record Collector magazine, or so. I might have been more like 11 than 10.
Right.
But it was certainly quite early on. And the first vinyl records I ever remember buying face-to-face, the mail order probably came second, I think. The first 45s that I ever remember buying with my own money that led me to 78s later on was Apache by the Shadows.
That's a classic.
I got a couple of others on the same day as that, and then within a few weeks of buying that, I got a couple of Duane Eddy 45s.
No, you can't go wrong with them.
No, so that's kind of how I drifted into 78s. And the first 78 I ever got was kind of an accident. It was I'd gone to my local flea market to look at the LPs and 45s because I don't think they really ever had. They might have just been going through a spell where they didn't have any 78s because he used to get his stuff from house clearances and auctions and things. And pulled out a few LPs and 45s to buy, and then there was like a table next to where the LPs were with some 78s on. I think there was only about 5 of them, and they were sort of spread out on this table. I think there was something like Gracie Fields, George Formby. I think there was like Joe Loss, HMV or something like that from the early 50s or something. That type of thing, later things. And then there was this smaller record, and I used to read, used to be able to get really good books out of the school library at that stage, like older books about anything really. And I used to read music. We used to have music history and technology books, so it would teach you about things like the Victor 33s from the 30s that they experimented with, and the first LPs and the first 45s, and what a cylinder was and all that. You know, they'd have diagrams and pictures, and they were good. I can't remember particular names of books, but that was something I'd done previously. So I knew that before vinyl LPs came out, they'd made these sort of experiment, kind of an experiment. I think that's what they were, these sort of early Victor 33 and a third things of extended music programs.
Yeah, there was an Ellington one, wasn't there? There was a Duke Ellington one.
Yeah, I thought there was some jazz one. I don't know what else. I guess the main
Toscanini
or show tunes or something. Right, they're the main ones. So I'd kind of read about those, even from a young age, sort of logged that in my mind as to like that these existed. And this smaller record on this table, which had broadcast written on, and the long playing record, made me think, oh, this is like some kind of radio transcription broadcast thing. It says it's an LP because it said it's long playing.
That had me fooled as well at first. That's exactly what I thought.
That happened to you as well?
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, well, this is worth spending 40p on. So I bought this. It was a Harry Bidgood record. Obviously, I didn't know that at the time because it had the Riverside Dance Band pseudonym on it. But I thought, obviously, with being young and naive, actually the area of Stockton where I live, where the river is, the Riverside, was actually near where that flea market was, and I kind of thought, oh, is this a local band? Is it a broadcast? Is it a radio thing? Is it, I didn't
it's interesting
really know
where your mind went there, yeah.
But I was kind of trying to work out what it was, bought it, and then put it on, trying to think what I tried to play it on. I think it might have been my dad's, or perhaps an inherited turntable from my granddad or something. It definitely wasn't one I'd bought.
Right.
Played it at 33, didn't work.
Sounded awful.
Yeah, played it at 45, it was better, but still not right. And I think my dad came past the room and said, oh, what's this? And I said, oh, I'm trying to play this, and it's not. He said, oh, it's because it's a 78. And I knew what a 78 was, but I hadn't realised that was also a 78 as well. With it being a flat size.
Yeah, 8 inches.
8-inch thing, yeah. So, and I think it was around that time, roughly, I can't remember the exact chronology of it, but my dad's auntie had recently passed away and had cleared the house and kept a few things, like obviously other than photos and personal things. There was a box of 78s and a Columbia 109 portable gramophone, which sadly was broken. The tone arm had either just been bashed up in transit or something. I think they're quite brittle, the parts on those.
Oh, don't even get me started on them.
But I thought, at least I've actually got something to play this thing on. If you actually held the arm or kind of managed to
guided it along the record, sort of.
Yeah, you could actually at least try and find out what this record sounded like. But I only played that one on there. I don't remember playing any of the other records on it. And then I saved up for a Thorens turntable when I got a paper round. So that's kind of... because I think I would have had a paper round shortly after this.
The Thorens are all right, aren't they?
Yeah. I seem to think it was... I bought it off online, and it was meant to be sort of approaching £300, but it was on sale.
Yeah.
And it was a couple of £100. I think it was an automatic one, unfortunately, so that didn't help me with the 8-inch records. But, so it was. I kept coming across these kind of in the early period of collecting 78s, these little problems. I ended up with. By the time I left school, I think I had a new Mark. I'd saved up to buy one of those, but which was a manual deck. But yeah, that's kind of the.
So which one was that Bidgood record? Was it?
Does She Love Me Positively, Absolutely, which I think has something like a bassoon solo in it.
That's an ace record, that.
Yeah, it's one of the only
it's
ones.
It's a good start.
Any kind of solo in it.
It's funny you should mention that, because that and How Long Has This Been Going On were both in the first box of 78s I ever bought.
All right.
Well, no, I was given them.
Yeah.
After me granddad had a load, and that was my introduction to them, this box turned up and they were both in there. So it's interesting, that, because what you're saying is, did broadcasts used to turn up very often where you were?
Yeah,
if I did hear.
Once, basically what kind of happened after I got those, and the box of records that my dad had passed on to me, which had been bought new in the 20s and 30s. I think there were a few later things from the early 40s, but they were mainly 20s and early 30s, and then there was a gap till the late 30s. Almost everything in that box, which had been originally bought in Newcastle, so further north of us.
Yeah.
Despite that, so there's a bit of a geographical difference, but local-ish.
Yeah.
They were mainly on those cheaper labels like Eclipse, Broadcast, Imperial. There was what else was there? There was quite a few sort of mid-price records like Piccadilly and stuff, but there were loads of Edison Bell radios, but there weren't any Edison Bell winners. There were no higher price I think there was maybe one. There was like a later Columbia, but that was an FB series, and I think that was a mid-price when they came in. So yeah, that was very interesting. I found that interesting that these were like labels that you hadn't seen on vinyl, if you know what I mean. Apart from Columbia, obviously you'd seen Columbia 45s and HMV 45s and stuff like that. But the closest thing I got to that from that box was a Melville Gideon on Zonophone.
Ooh,
which
is that one of his piano solo discs?
Yeah, well, it was a very well used copy of
Burnt Sugar. Is that one?
Yeah.
God, that's a rare record, that.
Yeah, I've got a nicer copy now, but that's...
Yeah, it took me a long time to find a nice copy of that. I had two.
Yeah, and I really liked that.
Yeah, it's cracking.
Shame it was so well, it wasn't so much... I don't think it had a lot of wear on it. And it was very scratched, and it was a lot earlier than the other records in that box. So I think a few of the earlier records in there, because there was like a couple of Regals from the mid-teens in there. I think they were perhaps bought second. I think they were probably bought second-hand or given to the person who'd owned these dance band records to maybe get them started, or so, because they didn't suit the rest of the batch, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But everything else seemed to be like Piccadilly, Imperial. I don't think there were many. I think there was a few Rexes, but they were later ones, 40s ones. But it was around that time that labels started to interest me. You know, like what?
Yeah.
You know, like what turns. But as you were saying about broadcast turning up here, yes.
Here too.
Those 8-inch things used to turn up a lot, as did 9-inch crowns.
Yes.
And you struggled to find 30s, right? Not 20s. 20s you could kind of find various things. I mean, you didn't find red parlophones or anything like that, exotic things like that. But you found HMV dance band records from the 20s and stuff, like the full price records. But the cheapest, definitely the cheaper labels used to turn up more often from here, especially the 30s things. Used to get a lot of Rexes and stuff like that.
I remember, because to give foreign viewers some perspective, we're both from the north of England, and I remember distinctly the first record I found from the period 1931 to 33, and I did not find another until I started buying collections. I found exactly one record from 1931 in my entire... This has got to be 8 years of frantically collecting records at car boots and going door to door.
That's interesting. That's my equivalent of that is...
And it was All That Kiss by Jack Payne, in case you wondered.
Yeah, which is one of the more usual Imperials.
Yes.
So yeah, kind of with me, how I describe it to people when I've talked to other collectors and other people about like what turns up 30s wise in different parts of the country is the Depression hit different areas differently at different times for different reasons. And up here, because it had to travel all the way up here, we didn't get it quite as soon, but it lasted longer. So I used to get records from 31, 32, but not as often as ones from 28 to 30, if you're looking at that vague period, if you like. But did used to get them. But after 32, there was nothing until about 39. Nothing.
Yeah, it picked up again here, I think, in about 35 or 6. I found...
Right, we didn't get... Well, obviously, up here, it was all like the Jarrah Marches and all that sort of stuff. So unemployment was much worse here, I think.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people here particularly kept for pit jobs.
Right.
And so they could buy... I mean, I'll tell you what, though, the records I found from that period, 31 to maybe 34, were absolutely tanked. Like, they were more knackered than the earlier ones, much more in some cases.
It's interesting you should say that, because occasionally at that same flea market, which I got the majority of my records from for until I started to go into fairs or like exchanging things with other collectors, and before I met you and all the rest of it, he actually used to find some quite clean 20s records quite often. Even the more expensive types, you'd usually find them as a batch. You'd have somebody who bought records perhaps just to show off, and they never played them, and they'd perhaps come from a house clearance a bit further afield or something like that. Irrespective of labels, you used to find some quite nice condition stuff mixed in with everything else.
Yeah,
but, the 30s stuff, even on the cheap that you used to find Eclipse records where there was no label left. The red was there, but the gold had gone, and the records were absolutely destroyed. And these were the cheapest records you could buy at the time.
Absolutely. I remember finding a Kasani Club Rex, and you could hear the other side. And it was that bad you could hear like a pre-echo of the other side. I think I kept that just to show people what happens if you absolutely destroy a 78. So after you started properly collecting 78s, what did you focus on anything particular, or what were your kind of things that you were particularly excited when you found them, I should say?
Well, sort of if we look at the period from when I started, say it was like 11, which I'd be sort of about 1996, 97, up to the first time I ever, when I passed my driving test and went to, I think that more or less the first thing I did was go to the Birmingham Motorcycle Museum record fair, which still is fairly 78 focused.
Never been.
And was it's well worth a visit. But back then it was even more 78 focused than it is now. So sort of between about 1996/7 and like 2004-ish, if that was basically had access to charity shops, the flea market, asking around people. They used to occasionally get given a pile of records by somebody or something like that, but the flea market was the big thing. Anything jazz related was exciting because you never normally saw it. You could see most other things. I remember the first time I got the first jazz, and when it even remotely jazz rather than a dance band record, if you like, that I ever found at that flea market was Hawaiian War Chant, Dorsey on HMV. So that's the kind of thing that initially, when I was like 13 or whenever it was, that was exciting because it stood out.
Do you know what? That's really interesting because round here, you've found that stuff really often.
Yeah, I did. It took me a while. Eventually it started happening, but in my it was weird that in my earlier days of collecting, you would more than likely find 20s and 20s records as often as you did sort of 50s. I don't know. I must have been the types of auctions and other places that because it was mainly one or two guys that ran this flea market, and other people had stalls as well. One or two blokes had like the majority of the tables, and I think it was just where he used to get stuff from, but they were old records. But there again, I suppose if people had bought them in the 20s and they were in their 20s, in the 90s, they were old people who were passing away, whereas years later it was slightly different. But yeah, so there was that Tommy Dorsey, and then I think I remember the first time I got a Benny Goodman parlophone, and think that was playable. That was exciting. And I got, I remember the first time this was a really good batch of stuff they got in from somewhere that were mainly in, there was a shop in Middlesbrough called Eads Record Service, and I think there was one in Sunderland as well, and they were in the shop sleeves. They'd been played, they'd been owned by somebody, but they'd been very well looked after. And there was Paul Whiteman's Bouncing Brass in there. They're quite nice. Quite a few Django Reinhardts on Decca. And I'd never seen these things before. And they were clean, and it was like, wow,
that's amazing.
Three for £1 when you used to, because all the records were like the same price basically. I think they were 50p set when he first got them in, and then after a week they were 3 for £1, and then they eventually went to 6 for £1 when he wanted rid of them. And you made sure you picked those out first. Not that anybody else bought 78s from this flea market, as far as I know. Unless they were like, I think there was probably odd people looking for rock and roll stuff, but I was told multiple times that I used to get first dibs on 78s because nobody else bothered. But yeah, definitely, I didn't have a particular focus, but jazz used to stand out, and obviously rock and roll would have stood out. And I think that probably without knowing what it really was at the time, probably the most historically significant record I ever got from that flea market was, I think there's two of them, two different records, and I'm sure I got more than one copy of both. The Murray Pilser Winner record.
It's funny, Matt, because I'd never seen. I actually bought one off you, off eBay.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I'd never seen them.
No, I think I think there was a. This was more or less going in, almost on the cusp of me going to record fairs. They got a particularly large batch of 78s in, and yes, there were 40s and 50s records mixed. It was either a weird collection or it was just an accumulation.
Like a father and son kind of collection.
I don't think it was. It was more of an accumulation from someone who bought them later, I think.
Yeah, that would make sense.
But perhaps they'd bought up smaller versions of those, like you say, father and son things, because there were some later things in there. But there was tons of like, sort of like Queen's dance orchestra type era things, early 20s HMVs. There was more than one copy of those Murray Pilser Winners, which was weird.
That is. I mean, for those that don't know, the Murray Pilser Winners, Edison Bell Winners, were possibly the first jazz record in the UK, and they are bloody awful. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah,
they're not very good, are they?
No, it's been described to me that the musicians were present and they were stood at the top of the stairs, and then they just fall down the stairs and go back to the top and fall back down again, and that's kind of, they're not playing the same tune as each other.
They're not very good.
No.
I think they're called jazz just by virtue of being sort of syncopated and rackety. But
they're trying it.
Yeah,
they are trying to do something like
to
that.
play,
they don't succeed at doing it, but
they are historically interesting records. And I bought that one off you, and then obviously I got the AMG Colonel's collection, and he had them. But I've never seen them until I got them from you. I'd never seen them in wild, that's for sure. I think Winners might be a case in point where they might have turned up more often in your neck of the woods than mine, because I did not find them.
The later ones didn't, but it was weird that, like, you used to get sort of piles or small boxfuls of records from the teens, whether they were Winners or something else, quite often. But you wouldn't have seen a Winner from 1929, a red label one. You didn't get those. It was weird, very strange, because I think in the teens, unless you bought the expensive records, Winner and those other kind of Scala things and stuff like that were the only things you could buy, or Cinch and stuff like that. Cinch records turned up a lot.
Did you just say Scala? Scala used to turn up?
Occasionally, but it was the earlier ones, not the later ones.
Do you know, it took starting the stuff of eBay for me to see one of them. They never turned up here.
I used to see shop covers quite often. Let's say it was a Winner in a shop cover. It would say stockists of Winner, etc., and it would usually say Winner, Beltona, Scala, Guardsman. But I never saw a Guardsman.
Did you ever see a Beltona?
Trying to think the first Beltona. I think Beltona, unless I'm mistaken, I think I got some Beltonas from a car boot sale when I'd started travelling around by car, but they were like, they were really nice ones actually. They were like churning lilts and things, like traditional Scottish.
Wow, yeah, those are rare.
From sort of, I think they were all from the same year, more or less, about 23-ish. But I never had a dance band one until I went to a record fair. It's
funny that, because the only time I got owners like that weren't Jimmy Shandy and his band was I went into a charity shop in Sheffield, and they had a box of 78, and right at the back of his box of Doris Day and Bing were 7 Gaelic language Beltonas, which I of course bought all of, and then about 4 months later I went back there and we had another 9. So they must have been from the same person. I think
well,
it's
they just
one
have
of
to
them.
put them all out. Perhaps it was like they don't put them all out at once. They put a box out to try them.
Well, they're all in the same old shop covers. So I think it's one of those with labels like that Beltona Guardsman Winner, which are, for those that don't know, kind of UK budget teens to 20s labels, aren't they? I think once you find one, you find a few.
Yeah, it just takes you a while to get the first one.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
That's what happens.
Once you find one, there's a few more where it came from.
But the kind of actually the winners that used to turn up most, and you'll have had some of these off me over the years when we've done swaps and things, because I'll have hung on to them. I'll have liked them, but not wanted to keep them forever type of thing, and you'll have ended up with these. Is more like the sort of vocal ragtime, sort of Jack Charman sort of things, and the various incarnations of the two Bobs and all this sort of thing. They used to turn up a lot, but not so much the dance bands. We used to find some of the Burgundy and Gold winners from the early to mid-20s, dance band-wise, Bohemian Orchestra type. But the Red Label ones, never really saw them till I started trading with people and going to fairs. And I find that weird, but I think they went up in price. Did they go up in price?
They may well have done.
And you never saw the gold ones until I got some Savoy players doing sort of the Mikado selections and stuff, early 30s ones. I had some of those.
Yeah, I got all them off you. I remember that. There were some Royal Court orchestra ones and things like that in there.
Yeah, they tended to turn up quite. Once you found a few. I think it was probably one of these things where, when I was on a budget when I was younger, because it was paper round money and stuff like that, those kinds of amounts of money, and you didn't know as much either, you made sure you got the stuff you wanted, and then you kept going back until they cleared the boxes away and brought some newer stuff down, and it was like you'd probably flick past things if you didn't really know what they were, so you'd probably actually had seen them, you just didn't take notice. If you saw one on its own, you'd be like, oh, well, I'll just buy this other thing instead. And I think I always assumed that, like, you'll see it another time if you miss something, which obviously we both know.
No.
That's not how it works.
It's certainly not how it works with earlier records. I mean, it blows my mind, and I think this is a big difference between here in the UK, that people in the US will talk about 1910-ish Victors like, oh, everyone's got this, and I'm like, there are no UK equivalents to that. I can't think of any. Maybe Abide With Me by Clara Butt on Columbia.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I used to go to the flea market, if there was a box of 12-inch records that weren't post-war, it tended to be that type, and it was. Unless it's just my memory not being quite right, but I think this is true. I didn't see the same stuff that often.
No, you never do.
I never used to. If they were Clara Butt records, there wouldn't be the same ones all the time. Like you saw them every few months from different that had come from different places. But you were going to the same place to look at records. You didn't just keep saying, because I can't really remember seeing things like Doris Day that much back then. That's a newer thing. That's something that's crept in over the last 10 or 12 years, that type of thing.
You see, I started collecting about, I'd say, 12 or 13 years ago, and Doris Day and Victor Sylvester were all I ever found.
Yeah, you used to see things like...
When you found something that wasn't them, you kept it.
Yeah. I kind of must have got in... I think I must have got into it when people who had bought records in the 20s and 30s that were actually interested in records as well as non-interesting ones were still just passing away, whereas like another 10 years and you're like another lump of time along. And it had changed. But you used to see Bing Crosby's and things, 30s and 40s Brunswicks, but 50s records, not nearly, even the NAF ones, not as much. Used to see them in charity shops, 50s records more often. But I think there was a difference between these house clearance flea market type environments and other places. Used to be able to get 50s pop records in record shops because they might only put out the ones that they thought that they'd actually heard of, because they obviously dealt in vinyl, so they'd heard of these 50s artists.
They'd heard of Bill Haley and his Comets. And
but I can't remember ever buying a Bill Haley record or anything similar at the flea market, but I could get them in second-hand record shops and word of mouth, and I used to get them from charity shops, and they weren't priced up in charity shops. They were just like everything else. So that's a bit weird.
It's a record, so it's 15 pence sort of thing.
And that's how I got some really rare rock and roll things that way. There was I don't know whether they still have many shops now, but the charity Shelter used to have a one in Stockton for a while. And there was also I think it was a YMCA one. They used to be 10 pence or 5 pence the records. It was like a really low price. And I remember getting things like Johnny Bennett Trio on Coral from.
Oh my word! Wow.
And things not too dissimilar.
The only time I'd ever seen one of them was in a frame.
Right.
It was in a vinyl record shop, and it was in a frame. Oh, really?
Yeah, I think the time came years later when certain things had to go. And that I wouldn't do it now because the need isn't there. But if the need's there, you have to do it. And,
of course.
But yes, that's an interesting thing about the rock and roll 50s thing is that they turned up in some places in the same town. In some places rather than others. The flea market was definitely a sort of the more older stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that, because my granddad was a bit of a teddy boy in his own right in the 50s, and he still had his original 78. So there were a couple of odd ones in there. There was a Warner Mac, which had a massive chunk out of it.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Was that Rocket Chicken?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, right.
And I remember that when it was complete, and then when it wasn't. So I don't know.
Right.
At some point, something happened to it. But he had several Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, Gene Vincent, even, and he had some nice stuff. He had Richie Valens on Pie. That came from him, which I played with a Columbia gramophone and knackered. Well, he did it first, and then I did it, because neither of us had a clue. We had a load of Lonnie Donegan Pie 78, so they all got played with steel needles, which is an atrocious thing to do to them. But anyway, nobody knew. But what I mean is, I think, in a sense, I had a leg up, because he had a load of mates who were his friends from back then, and he said, hey, my grandson's looking for records, and so I got a leg up. But I used to find rock and roll all the time. I used to find it in most charity shops. Had one Bill Haley record, and an Elvis. And the other stuff, the rare stuff, you never saw, but the more common things, you did find. You never saw any rockabilly, proper rockabilly.
The rarer things just turned up occasionally, but if to put in perspective, it was like, and you can probably mirror this with your own experiences from later, is that from being about 11 or whatever the age was, all the way through school and beyond, I used to go to that flea market twice a week, and I used to go to the charity shops twice a week, if not more, and that's a lot of visits. So if you're going to you will find it. You're only going to find it if you look for it. And other people, obviously, I didn't know anyone my own age that bought records or anything, but I didn't know anyone else that put that kind of effort into something that wasn't either work or schoolwork or so. Like they didn't have
finding
a hobby
drugs or whatever.
Yeah. They didn't do collecting or kind of even people who had Airfix kits and stuff like that used to just do it on a Sunday. They didn't do it 3 times a week. So it was like, I put the work in to get to, you had to put the time in.
Yes.
But I think the time was more important than the money, because the money was the same whatever the record was, really. It was just a case of putting the time in, and eventually you'd find these things. But I was the same with the Bill. Like, I had most of the usual suspects of the Bill Haleys, but they were all scuffed. They were all downdated records, you know. But I did have them. But eventually, they were the easiest ones to upgrade, because eventually you'd find a clean one, because they did sell really well.
I never found one. You know,
Gene Vincent's and Eddie Cochran's and things were really hard. The Buddy Holly's and the Crickets things were kind of in the middle, rock and roll wise. You did used to see them, particularly Peggy Sue and Oh Boy and things, but the Gene Vincent's didn't sell.
The only ones I found were from my granddad. I didn't find any. He had 6 of them, and because he really liked it. He even had. Which he's still got somewhere, Lacknit's cover, and it looks like it's been walked on. But he had an original capital LP of a record date, and I think he might have got to see Gene Vincent live, and he's got some interesting rock and roll stories actually, because he did get to see. No, it wasn't him; it was his mate Don who got to see Buddy Holly, and yeah, so that sort of thing goes in my family, so I've got quite a lot of that. But the earlier stuff, it took I managed to get a good collection of swing, and I think you probably did as well eventually, just from second hand. And I kind of had to tell people, look, I'll swap you swing records for acoustic popular stuff. And if you tell people that, they'll go, "Wow, have you lost your marbles?" I'll do that.
But I mean, once I started getting swing records, it was almost like buses. A load came along at once, and I think the turning point was maybe car boot sales made the difference. Because that was different people, especially if you travelled to, because I used to quite often go to Weatherby boot sale, which for the benefit of people listening in is like I'm from like the northeast of England. That's where I've lived for most of my life. And if you went sort of 40 or 50 miles south, you're going to see people who are from a different radius, and if they're a full-time dealer, like an antique dealer or something, they'll go to a car boot sale to sell their lesser value things or their less bulky things because the bulky furniture's in their shop, and they take other stuff to car boot sales, and it just meant you got to look through some different records. And I used to find, obviously now you wouldn't think anything of it, but like you'd find Harry James records, Benny Goodman's and Bunny Berrigan's and things, and it was like, wow, big deal. And trad stuff, I'd always liked trad jazz stuff, but I didn't really have many sort of Humphrey Littletons and Chris Barbers and things. But then when I started getting them, I got loads. I got hundreds. Like in no
Do you know
time.
what? The trad jazz was the stuff that you'd see an Elvis, a Bill Haley, a Charlie Kuntz, a Reginald Dixon, and a load of trad jazz, and that was what you'd see in car boot sales in Yorkshire. I mean, the Yorkshire Jazz Band Esquires, at some point I had a complete set of, and I don't think they're common by any means, but they are here.
No, it took me a long time to get things like Esquires. Were the more specialist labels took longer, but obviously you were just in the right place for. It's another regional example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Buying.
Good Time Jazz is another one. I had loads and loads of stuff on there, 78s and LPs, and I think, did you get that off me? There's a box of Good Time Jazz hanging around here if you haven't already had it.
I think that one of the last times we got quite a decent amount of good, including quite a lot I didn't have. But that's another label where, like, if you ever, in your relatively early days of collecting, if you actually get a collection that rather than just looking through piles and boxes of random records, if it's a jazz collection, it's quite likely to be either swing or sort of early 50s trad stuff. Once you get that kind of trad revival collection, it gets you started, and then you start thinking, I want to fill in some of these gaps. It's almost, I think it's like almost like a confidence booster. You feel like if you were anything like me to some extent, there'll have been some music, whether it's jazz or whatever, that I suppose by the time I was in my mid-teens, I did focus a little bit on that, but it was because I wasn't finding it very much. And then as soon as I found it, I thought, oh, I'm in the club now. I'm kind of, I belong to, I could actually call myself a collector now, whereas I didn't before that. I just thought, I just went around looking for, smelly old records, and that was about it, really.
Yeah, now that's interesting, because I've never thought, because for the benefit of those that know, I'm pretty autistic, and I have absolutely no idea about social norms at all. So belonging to a club is something I've never considered in my whole life. I could not care less if I don't belong anywhere. It just doesn't bother me, whatever. So me going around and collecting and actively looking for things like John Bull and Beaker and Jumbo and stuff no one else could give two figs about. I wonder if that has helped. I never thought about it before, but I wonder if that has made me collect stuff that's quite far off a beaten track.
Well, you've probably spent 100% of your collecting, which I'll come on to my equivalent in a minute, but 100% of your collecting life just buying either things that interest you, that you like playing, or things that you believe should be shared and have some historic value. Whereas I've probably spent about, and I include vinyl in this as well, because obviously I collect vinyl as well as 78s, but when you do get that influence from other people, it never took a full hold of me, but I was influenced by other people, and you can kind of just end up buying what other people buy, and that's not, that's
no fun.
That wasn't how I started, and actually how I collect now, and have done for quite a few years, is much more like what I collected like when I was sort of in the early to middle period, or early to mid-teens even. It's just buying things because I like them, and I'm prepared, and when time allows, I share them. And I think that's a much better way of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely, it is.
So yeah,
I mean, if you've, I just can't imagine, and I suppose collectors must do this to an extent. I've got 85 Duke Ellington HMVs. I'm missing 4, and like losing sleep, or essentially trying to get those missing records to the detriment of missing out other stuff that's far more interesting. And I feel a lot of collectors do that. Ian McPherson, who I don't think you met, but you knew.
I corresponded with him and I bought stuff. Nice guy.
Yeah, he was. He was a very nice.
Came across a nice guy.
He was a very nice guy. He was a big influence on me collecting. But he told me once he just paid £300 for a record he didn't actually like, just so that he could add it to, so that the gap was filled. And I just sort of rolled my eyes at that. And
yeah, I've come across people like that a few times, and it's kind of like if it is really what they want to do, that's their business. That's fine. It's their money. They've worked for the money. They can spend it however they want or whatever the situation is. But for me, because I started buying on impulse, it got very difficult to kind of sort of change. So I never really did.
Yeah, I think
that's. I mean, there's certain artists where I'd be like, I'd quite happily have all their stuff. I don't go out my way, but I would have them. But then other things, but let's just say an artist made one bad record, I wouldn't own that for the sake of it. I'd quite happily, if someone made 50 records, I'd have 49 and be happy because I wouldn't want the 50th one. So, whereas some people would be like, no, you've got to have the 50. But I've never done that. So.
And I think space plays a part in that as well, because I'm finding at minute you've seen my state of affairs, it's horrendous. I have way too many records as it is, without agonising over. Oh no, I'm out of all of Caruso's G&Ts. I'm missing one. I've got to get it. I'd much rather fill my time with getting different records that I hadn't heard or thought of before, and I think to an extent as well, the sort of stuff that you collect has sort of an impact on that, because if you collect like I do and like you do to an extent, obscure early stuff that there's no chance of you ever hearing on CD, then you collect it because you want to hear it, and there's no other way of hearing it. But if you collect 30 swing records, you could probably hear it, and you probably know what you're getting into, and it's a different way of making decisions, I think.
Yeah, because I suppose the swing thing, very much like sort of other types of jazz or blues or rock and roll or whatever, you can probably hear the same performance on multiple formats, and things like that. And I think angle makes a big difference, because there will be collectors listening to this that do things similar to us, or with some minor differences for just personal taste or whatever. And then there's people that do something completely different to us. And it might be they've collected longer and do it differently. It might be that they've come in after I did, and they had access to things like YouTube or books or internet like references, and they could actually almost predetermine what they were going to buy. I could do that, and I think it was better not to.
Now here's a thing. Do you think collecting pre-internet was an entirely different world than it will be now?
It couldn't be more different, I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And I actually think that obviously you can only go by your own experiences, but if I was collecting 78s now, and I was relying on the new methods, if you like the internet and the sort of newer resources and hearing things before I bought them and stuff like that, if you didn't know any different, you would just do that. But knowing what I know about the other type of collecting, almost like the tail end of junking, if you like, I wouldn't want to trade it. I would want to do it how I did it, because it wasn't just the records. It was the interactions. It was the going out, and it was like a goal without having a goal, if you like. It was like, what am I going to find today? And you wouldn't know.
It was much more exciting than trawling eBay, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very exciting. And with the flea market, car boot sales, charity shops, and to a lesser extent the record shop thing, is like people get to know you and you get to know them, and also you get the whole, very much like, I suppose, what some pubs are like, or what some other sort of venues and places are like that you visit. You absorb the characters, you sort of, it's a very social situation, whereas kind of, it's okay filling in gaps buying online or buying off a list. I've always done that for most of me collecting, or not filling in gaps, but buying things you don't see very often in different ways. But actually getting out there and meeting people and looking through the physical, looking through things and not knowing what you're going to find is the mysterious positive side of collecting for me.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I'm in a position now where pre-coronavirus I used to get 5 or 6 emails a day. That's massively dropped off now, I think, because everyone used to find stuff in Grandad's attic and they can't visit Grandad anymore. But
there is that, yeah.
But, you know, I get lists and lists and lists of records, and they're always worth looking through. Always worth looking through. Don't ever, as a collector, if you're just starting to collect records and you find a box of records and first 25 Bing Crosby, don't just think, oh, well, sod this, I won't bother looking through the rest, because you know what you'll find. I mean, what experiences have you had like that? Just random disc of massive interest in amongst a load of rubbish?
It's happened online and in person. You get things like, what an online example would be, this guy about probably, it doesn't show up on PopPsych, so I'm guessing it's pre-2004 or 5, because PopPsych only goes back so far.
Yeah.
It's probably about 2002 or 3. I got a Dr. Ross 78 off eBay for about a tenner or 20 quid or something.
What, on Sun?
It's not one of the Sun ones. It's the DIR one, the one on his own label, which is from about 59. I think.
Could be even rarer, that, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think that's it's probably won't. It's not as desirable as the Sun's, but it got pressed in a lot less quantity. Because I think actually one or two of the Sun ones sold reasonably well, given the type and the regional nature of the sales of Sun at the time. I think it was just described as like a record, and then the photos, and then in the description it said, "Oh, like very good condition, nice condition or whatever." And it is. It's in E condition, and all of the other stuff he was selling, with one or two exceptions, were like Pat Boone on London, and so I'm just like, where is this Dr. Ross record come from?
The Colonel had an experience like that, which is hilarious, because it were a guy who had a load of Embassy records from the 50s, and he was trying to flog them at like a £5, and right in the middle of all these, he had 4 1905 Sistine Vatican choir with Vat Castrato, Moresni on G&T, Vatican label G&Ts.
Mixed in with...
Yeah, it's just bonkers, isn't it? And you can look through lists, and it's like Pat Boone, Bing Crosby, the Dixieland Jug Blowers, that happened once. What is Pat doing there?
Yeah, it's another. You'll like this example. Two very different, interesting things in one batch. The local record shop to me, which I think is now the last, up until recently, was the last record shop in the area, and it's had a documentary made about it. And obviously, it's very vinyl and CD orientated, and was at the time. And the new I liked 78, so they used to either put a box out and kind of nobody else would even look at them, so I would get first dibs that way, or they'd hold them back for me. And one box had a single-sided, really early Columbia in it.
Wow.
One where it doesn't credit the artist.
Is it announced?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, that's
I'm trying to think what it was now, but I think that I dated that to around 1902 at the time.
Yeah, 3-ish.
And in the same box, and that was really nice and clean. It stood out from everything else in the box, so that's super early. And most of the other things were like Charlie Cunn's medleys on Decca and Rex and things. But then there was a Cliff Richard from 1960 on Columbia, which was Voice of the Wilderness.
The end of the scale.
Yeah, so it was like the earliest thing you could reasonably expect to find, apart from a Berliner, basically. And then like more or less the latest thing you could find without it being a sort of vinyl mood music thing, because that's the only pretty much, and one or two Embassies that are later than that. So yeah, that was things like that used to happen sometimes, where it'd just be like what's gone on here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember finding one of the collections. So I used to go door to door a bit, and I met this guy who, at some point, his brother had played with Chris Barber, and he was a big trad jazz fanatic, and he had all these sort of good time jazz and Vogue and that sort of thing, 78s, and I was like, oh, this is nice, I'll buy the lot. There were 200 of them, I think. He was happy with a tenner or something. And and he was a really nice guy, and I said, if I buy these, do you want them putting on tape? And he said, oh yeah, that would be smashing, yeah. So I did that. And right in the middle of all this 1950s trad jazz were 2 American records. One was a Bailey's Lucky 7 Jeanette.
Wow.
And the other was Walk Jenny Walk by the original Memphis 5 on Columbia. And they were literally the first acoustic jazz records I'd ever found, and they blew my mind. Like, that was really the beginning of the end for me. That was where everything descended into chaos, because I started hunting acoustic records. The first acoustic record I ever found was a twin of a military band, and I just remember standing there and holding it, going, "Wow, this is old," And
yeah, I think that's what I did when I first found it, because I didn't really know that it was like why it was different. It just seemed old, and I can't remember what the first, apart from those records I got given at the beginning, actual records I bought. I think it might even have been a twin itself, same as yours, or it might have been a Harry Lauder on. Might have
Celebrity
been a
Zono.
Might have been a single-sided green Zonophone or something like that by Harry Lauder, but I definitely had the double-sided later Celebrity red label things of his and stuff. So there were acoustic recordings, even if they were later pressings. But yeah, you could tell there's something old about this, and I didn't really know why.
Yeah, much heavier, and I think that was the giveaway for me. So what
had a totally different look.
Yeah, exactly. What do you see as like the future of collecting 78s? Is it all going to be? I think I've got a pessimistic view of it. I think people will hyper focus on stuff that they think is cool, so jazz, blues, country, and just leave everything else. And I think the internet's had a massive part in that.
Yeah, there's and also other factors in the media. So, like, you've got things like where within the last 10 or 15 years, there's been fads with people buying kind of Charleston or big band 78s and having a machine, and perhaps they'll only own a few dozen records because it's connected to the sort of 20s, might be a 20s fashion revival, or it might be a World War II reenactment thing, and they've got into records because they're into, I don't know, Bovril tins or something, and they collect other things to do with that era, and they drift into the music side, or they dance to that music at events and stuff. So with the exception of that, I think the actual proper sort of in-depth collecting of 78, I think, is, I don't sort of see it as positive or negative. I think this is kind of what I would just call realistic, is that it'll probably go the same way as vinyl. I think that you'll see a big drop in the number of people, as has probably already happened, people buying things like Fats Domino, Elvis, and stuff like that, from the sort of 50s point of view, and they'll buy obscure stuff. So the obscure rockabilly things and stuff will stay in vogue, and like you said, blues and stuff. But I also think that, so I'm kind of on the same page as you to that extent, but I also think the size of collections will be a big change. Yeah. Which has always actually already happened to an extent, because a lot of the, you used to hear about people that had very, very big collections.
Yeah.
Who would now, if they were still around now, or some of the older people that still are kind of 80, 90 plus, who were collecting records in like the 60s, and they managed to either collect or accumulate huge numbers because they were available, and it took years to get them, and they collected whatever they collected. But nobody has the space for that really now. I mean, there are exceptions, but most people who would pick up on a hobby don't have that type of space.
Yeah, and think, again, that hyper focuses on the cool and the Charleston and the iconic things, doesn't it? Yeah. Often very famous things like Al Bully and stuff like that, or and obviously other styles of music equivalents. If you're spending bigger money on things, you're not going to accumulate the numbers of records anyway. So and a lot of that
kind of goes hand in hand with each other. I think the big change.
I mean, I know collectors who literally, well, one in particular, and she can't. If she sees a box of records, she doesn't have the space to take the whole box, even if someone offered it.
Right?
And that means that she probably buys a few records here and there that she's particularly after. And that's that. Which I
think that's probably going to become more.
Yeah.
That situation and things that aren't too different are going to become more obvious, because more and more people live in flats than they used to. People live in other types of shared scenarios where you can't just have a load of stuff of anything. It wouldn't just be records. It could be anything. And I think collecting will have to sort of follow logistical and lifestyle changes. And I think that, like you say, there'll be more people buying smaller amounts.
What do you reckon's going to happen to all the uncollectible stuff? I'm looking at my shelves of records and going, oh dear.
Right. Well, I'm kind of thinking, that for a while it'll probably just be, you'll still get people who think, oh, these are old, so they must be worth money. So they would actually buy a collection of records that we wouldn't buy and try and sell them, fail to do it, and then either put them into smaller batches and they'll drift back into the collecting community to some extent, or they'll just get scrapped because they'll just get binned.
Yeah.
It's just sad to say that.
Yeah.
But, and then eventually enough people will try that and fail at it, try at selling them or doing anything with them. And then I think the only realistic way of kind of recruiting people into this in the future is actually on the basis that if you can kind of if you could just get a few people into it who perhaps, even if they didn't have the space, would accumulate some records and then donate things at intervals, so at least the music survives even if the records don't.
See, this is what I do. I mean, when I get a load of records that I don't want, and I don't think any of my collector friends are going to want, I'll just go on local Facebook get rid of it site and say, I've got loads of records, do you want them? And people, most of the people that come and get them, and this leads on to my next question really, don't know what a 78 is until they pick them up. They're like, oh, I can't play these on my LP player.
Right.
What do I do?
Right.
And then it'll go one way or the other, either get a gramophone to play them on, or they'll chuck them in the skip, which is probably where those should belong in the first place if I'm getting rid of them. But I suppose the other question is, do you think that people, how often do you tell people, oh, I collect 78s, and they're like, what's one of them?
I usually start it by saying that I collect records, because obviously I do collect
people know
vinyl
what
anyway.
they are,
And then you can kind of, if you do get, which you usually do from younger people, oh, well, what's a 78? Or like, what I sort of say, like, I go down the gramophone route. I mention that.
Yeah.
And then they kind of think, oh, those. But that's not a conversation that really crops up that much. But yeah, increasingly a lot of people don't. I think the only reason why really young people know what records are is because of the vinyl revival.
Do you think that's changed 78? Do you think? Because I do. I think the vinyl revival has given people a false illusion that, wow, these records are old, they must be valuable.
Yeah, that does happen. I think that is definitely a thing, but it hasn't boosted people collecting them.
No, it hasn't.
It's kind of given people who might want to find something new to sell to supplement their income another idea, regardless of what ends up happening with the idea in the longer term. But no increased numbers of collectors have come out of that. It's literally a vinyl revival, and even then, it's only certain types of vinyl. It's not all. It's not everything. So, a really good thing to ponder with this is like, we're thinking about how will 78 collecting go into the future and how will it change, but we're mainly thinking about people who currently collect and what will they collect in the future, rather than like, who are the newbies going to be in another 10 or 20 years' time, which is